All right, my apologies. I had to stop my last recording because I was afraid it wasn't actually working. And I wanted to be able to show this video. So back to it, trauma and the developing brain. I thought this would be a very helpful video to see just how the lasting effects of trauma.
Brain development is much more than a story about biology. From the earliest years, relationships with others play a key role in shaping how our brain grows and develops. Early relationships, where there is abuse and neglect, have a long-term impact on children. A brain that has adapted to survive in a threatening or unpredictable world may not work so well in an ordinary environment. This can create what is called latent vulnerability, where early abusive or neglectful experiences with carers put children at greater risk of experiencing mental health problems in the future. For these children, compared to their peers, common experiences like moving to a new school can feel more daunting and stressful. New faces can appear threatening, while positive social cues can be missed. It can be harder to negotiate new social situations and learn to trust new people. Even fun experiences like joining a new sports team can be challenging. Too much focus on potential threat cues can mean missing out on positive social cues such as a playful nudge. Or it causes an overreaction, which leads to an increased risk of conflict and sometimes violence. These reactions can increase the likelihood.
I will say, for myself, I can't say that's like rage is something I experience, but I know that when people would accuse me of things that I hadn't done, my reaction was always so intense because I was so used to that happening in my family that I would, this is how my trauma came out, that I would react not in balance with the tone that was offered to me when I was, accused of whatever it was. Never was it something that was bad. So example, I remember one time I was in middle school, 5th or 6th grade, and I was stung by a bee. And I went to the nurse's office, and when I came back, someone was like, "Oh, you missed this." And then I yelled, "I was stung by a bee." And I had to like yell it to people. Maybe a little rageful. I recognize it now as just this overreaction to something that I viewed as a threat because that with my family would have been something that I could have been penalized for, that it was my fault it happened. So I responded in a way that was like I was with my family. All right, let's go.
Of generating new stressful events. It's harder to deal with everyday challenges when you feel unconfident and anxious inside, and harder to build and maintain relationships. Over time, this can mean a child loses friends and the support of adults, and so misses out on opportunities to grow and develop. This social thinning can increase the risk of mental health problems in the future. Neuroscience research is beginning to shed new light on how vulnerability unfolds over a child's life. All children need care and stimulation from adults who value them and who show them attention and love. These experiences shape a child's brain development. When children face traumatic experiences like abuse and neglect, their brain adapts to help them cope. We know of changes in 3 different brain systems: the reward, memory, and threat systems. Experiences of domestic violence or physical abuse can lead to hypervigilance, where the brain reacts more to threat. This might help a child stay safe in an early adverse environment, but it can cause problems in more ordinary environments.
This is also called, and I was told this after, staying in survival mode. If you experienced especially complex trauma growing up, it's very difficult to leave survival mode.
Environments. Hypervigilance can best be understood as a pattern of adaptation rather than a sign of damage. Abuse and neglect can also mean a world where a child's basic needs for care and attention are not met. This can shape the brain's reward system, the part of the brain that helps us learn about positive aspects of our environment and motivates our behaviour. Over time, the brain's reward system can learn to respond differently to things like positive social cues. Neuroscience studies have also pointed to changes in the autobiographical memory system, our memory of everyday past experiences. Following trauma, negative memories appear to become more salient, which means they become more prominent than positive ones. And everyday memories can also become less detailed. This is a problem because we need to draw on past experiences to help us deal with new social situations. Neuroscience research is showing how childhood trauma can create.
That's true for all learning, where we draw on past experiences and knowledge, so it's important to be able to grab that quickly.
Latent vulnerability, increasing the risk of later mental health problems like anxiety and depression. This vulnerability is not just located in the child, but arises through their relationships. Helping children who have experienced trauma still requires ordinary boundaries and consequences, but it also requires us to step back and reflect and see behaviour that we find challenging in a different light. A child may simply be doing their best to survive now, with brain adaptations from the past. We know a child's brain has the capacity to continue to adapt. For this to happen, they need our help to build and maintain trusted relationships, manage everyday stresses, and prevent new ones from happening. We need to encourage them to try again and believe things can be different. This is far from an easy task and takes time. Science is helping reframe our understanding of childhood trauma. Seeing children's behaviour in a new light can mean we respond differently. But there is much still to learn. Working together, we can develop more effective approaches that promote resilience and recovery. We can help children build trusting relationships and create opportunities for their brains to adapt in new ways.
So I really like that video because it does really highlight how difficult it can be to escape trauma that you've experienced. So basically, we know there's latent vulnerability, which means impact of trauma in childhood is observed throughout adolescence and adulthood, throughout the lifespan, let's say. And I will say I myself experienced this as well, where because of just constantly being told this and that, and being in a chaotic environment, which I was just unsure of how to approach a lot of different situations. And so for me, as an adult, it's more difficult. It takes longer because I developed these behaviors that were survival behaviors, but they actually didn't help me succeed in the real world. And that's the truth, is like, obviously in the situation in the video, you have this young man who, in response to what seemed to be playful, responding not in kind, right? Responding with actual physical aggression. One, that's how trauma and domestic and physical abuse is so cyclical, because of how we were raised and how we can be so quick to engage in that same rage we observed, and also so hard to address as a teacher, right? So the reward and threat system are I don't want to say are disturbed, in that we don't have the same response to rewards if they weren't provided in a healthy way. And I think what it means, as if you are someone who's going to educate, again, know the individual, and understand the impact the impact of their history, is what I would say. Because what can happen, and I've done this too, I'll bring up a story later, is if we don't respond to children who have experienced trauma in the right way, for lack of a better phrase, but in the right way, typically we're only going to escalate it. That has always been my experience. If you see a child who has experienced incredible trauma and engages in these rageful behaviors or physically aggressive behaviors, and your response is to yell and deliver punitive consequences, oftentimes you're not going to change and you're not supporting that child to be comfortable in the room. Offer unconditional support for expected behavior. Offer resources to address challenges. And this is the other piece, regardless of what field you're in, there's a lot of people who are involved in the development of a young child. And so if there is a child who has this severe trauma, let's find an appropriate child psychologist or therapist who can start to address this and provide strategies to families and schools sooner than later. But really developing strong, supportive relationships with students, with children, really, is the best way to overcome some of that traumatic experience. It's not the only thing that will work because oftentimes it's extremely complex, but it is one of the most important pieces, is developing a relationship before you make any judgments. Okay, all right, let's go back to the PowerPoint. Moving on. This I thought would be fun. Since last week was too long, although I'm not sure if you started the other one after this, but before we get into theories and theorists, I want to do a little brain break. And this one you can do right in your seat. So
now we're going to work on our mental health with a focus activity called Pinky Thumb. What you're going to do is open your hands up like this, make sure your palms are facing you, close them into fist. We're going to put one thumb out on one hand, one pinky out on the other. And when I count to 3, we're going to switch. 1, 2, 3, switch. Let's try again. 1, 2, 3, switch. Now, some of you at home may be wondering, wow, this is more challenging than I expected. But guess what? Our brain loves challenges. And I want to break down what's happening in our brain as to why this activity is sort of challenging. So everybody put your fists like this, put them close together. This is about the size of your brain. And the way your brain works is that one half of your brain controls the opposite side of your body, which means the other half controls the other side. When we do 2 different things at the same time on each side of our body, we're working both halves of our brain. Our brain loves this. So that's why we incorporate these exercises. These are called neuroplasticity exercises. So let's try it one more time, but we'll break it down. Thumb out, pinky out, thumb in, pinky in. Thumb out, pinky out, thumb in, pinky in. As we get better, we'll go back to both out, both in, both out, both in, both out, both in, both out, both in. Great job. Keep practicing. Don't give up. I promise you'll get better and better as you keep going.
Hope you enjoyed that. I thought that was really cool, and I'm probably going to do that every week. I will say, I don't even know if I have the camera on this time, so you should be able to see me. I have arthritis in my right hand, partially because something I'm not sure I've shared, aside from being someone who is on the autism spectrum, well, not aside, part of it is that I do have these behaviors that are called stimming behaviors. And that means that for me, when I'm really excited about something or enjoying something, I will mush my fingers together like this and do this. And it's completely involuntary. I've been doing it for a very long time. When I was younger, I would fall back in my chair and my fingers would wiggle. And this was kind of my way of making it a more socially appropriate behavior. But in the end, I don't have much control over the pinky in my right hand. And I have a lot of pain if I write too much. So that one was exceptionally hard, but I also have issues with my left and right brain. So it's good for me to do those. All right, hopefully that was fun. That doesn't. Now the fun part, theories and theorists. Clearly I'm joking. I'm gonna go through these pretty quickly because there are so many. You'll clearly hear which ones I like the most and which ones are just because we need to know how we got to where we are. We'll start with, and I have these kind of in order of how they, when these theories were introduced over the course of our, over time, chronologically. And so Maturationist, which is by Giselle, I never remember, is one of the first theories. This is where we have our developmental milestones. And this is where we believe development was mostly predetermined by genetics. And that whatever skills children mastered was actually because they were passed down from their biological parents. And I like this quote, "Children simply mature as they get older. They will turn out as they will, with little influence from the outside world." I'm not going to cover this that much, mainly because we do know that genetics has a role in our development, but this theory does not explain atypical development. It doesn't really explain the origins or presentations of disabilities, because not all disabilities are hereditary, and not all presentations of disabilities are the same. This is going to be a question on everyone because I think it's important in this course that we have an understanding of how can we explain atypical development. Some of it is from genetics, but not all of it. And in truth, it's not clear either. It's a potential genetic abnormality for some, or potential with things like autism and ADHD, it's not a mutation. It's actually just a different modulation of your genetic sequence. I'm getting ahead of myself. Behaviorist. This is one that it has been heavily researched. We have the terms classical and operant conditioning coming from here, which if you've read it, any psych, intro psych course will talk about behaviorism and Skinner's dog, or the Skinner box. Actually, now I'm trying to think about who the dogs were. I thought it was Skinner. But the ability to train something to respond in a certain way after using a series of repeated exercises. So one of my favorites, oh, now I wish I was playing the clip. If you've seen The Office, there's an opening scene in The Office when Dwight and Jim, who are always involved in pranks, Jim has decided that every time he turns his computer on, he's going to give Dwight an Altoid. And he proceeds to do this every time he turns his computer on. And eventually he doesn't even ask. Dwight is just ready for the Altoid. And then one day, the computer turns on, Dwight's hand is out, and there's no Altoid. Perfect example of really of conditioning. And I'm trying to remember classical conditioning versus operant conditioning. I have to look at my book. I'm like, I don't even remember so well. But the ability to mold behavior in a way that the person wants to target a particular behavior is where behaviorist comes from. So, and really development is derived from experience. And more than anything, children learn when adults shape their learning using techniques intended to influence behavior. Jim did that. Skinner did that with his dogs and offering food whenever there was a bell ringing. So the target, and if you think about it, the target behavior for each of those, Jim was targeting Dwight's instinct to hold his hand out for the Altoid. Skinner was actually controlling his dog's salivary glands and was able to get them to salivate at the sound of a bell because he had taught them that when the bell sounds, they get food. Behaviorism is fascinating. It's also the easiest theoretical perspective to validate because we can research it and measure it. Behaviorists have a very clear, behavior is very clearly measured through different types of strategies. Applied behavior analysis is common when we're working with kids with autism, and it became the most prevalent strategy because we could measure it and demonstrate its effectiveness with learning discrete skills so easily. However, there's some caution to this. Oh, I like this. Babies, Watson described babies as a lively bit of squirming flesh capable of making a few simple responses. And really most of that response was a very behaviorist term because your response was contingent on whatever the environment put out, right? But behavior does not take into account that there are true genetic differences that lead to personality characteristic differences, predispositions. We know that development cannot be derived from experience alone. And we also know, and something I caution is when we're using behaviorist methods to change behavior, make sure we're doing it for the right reasons. I think my biggest struggle working in autism is people changing behaviors, adults changing behaviors because they didn't seem appropriate, but they really, or, trying to stop a kiddo from flapping, which is a stimming behavior. You're never going to stop that because that child is going to need to, and I know this myself, engage in that behavior to express themselves. And what we really do is we find replacement behaviors that are appropriate for the child, that are appropriate for the social environments that they're in. I could get into this forever. I'm going to keep going. But this theory, although provides a lot of research, has a lot of research backing, does not count indirect environmental influences or genetic influences. Social learning theory, which is very similar to behaviorist theory. Sorry about the animations. So praise and reinforcement, which we all know came from this. And more than using specific techniques, the idea is adults model expected or, again, desirable under the adult's eyes, behaviors to developing children. And this theory can involve adults modeling behavior and providing reinforcement, typically in the form of praise when the child uses the expected target. I like this. Praising that is contingent upon a child performing in a desired way is important. Again, not all children respond to praise. Let me be very clear. And something that I believe was talked about in our book or has been discussed is that praise does not, I believe this is in the text, is not appropriate or not rewarding, not an appropriate reinforcer, meaning it will continually make that behavior happen because the children want that reward. It's actually not effective across all cultures. And so really when we're thinking of praise, we really need to think about white children. It's typically very effective for white middle-class children. We can't say the same for children in different cultures. And also, again, not all disabilities respond the same way. Not all children with special needs respond the same way. And in truth, we can reinforce a behavior, but not all children are tuned into adult models. Not all children can even recreate what is modeled to them. That might not be an effective instructional strategy. So my piece on social learning theory. Psychoanalytic theory. This one I'm going to go really quick. This is where we get the id, the ego, and the superego. This is where we think about the resolution of inner conflicts at different stages. And this is more of a Freud thought. A healthy child is one who learns to walk this line between their urges that they want immediately fulfilled and their control of those urges. This is also where Erik Erikson came up with these stages of psychosocial development, and this is where we have these conflicts. So infancy, not surprisingly, trust and mistrust. That's very basic need developed, or not a very basic conflict that happens through, and we don't talk about this in this chapter, but attachment to parents, right? Autonomy versus shame and doubt. Toileting is an example because that's when we are forcing our children to be independent because we can't go to the bathroom for them, and it's not socially acceptable to wear diapers your whole life. And so this is where we say, children, you take the initiative to independently use the bathroom, or you don't, and typically experience shame or doubt. I'm not going to go through this. I don't think they're very important. It's just, I want you to have this understanding of where psychoanalytic theory came from. There's some pieces that you could say are accurate. I think the most would be adolescence, identity versus role confusion, because we do see a lot of our young students clinging to these different identities in hopes to find something that fits, because that's what we're really seeking. And I do think that's true. But this theory does not explain atypical development. It's very difficult for me to even apply some of this to children with disabilities that are, they have at birth. It's difficult for me to even think about how these are relevant to children with disabilities who are profoundly impacted by those disabilities. And these cognitive operations, they might not even get to all of them. But again, I want you to also think about that as well. All right, this one you've probably heard of before, the good old Piaget. Piaget is the pioneer of cognitive development theory, and he brought up these terms of assimilation, accommodation, and cognitive development or social cognition. And basically the idea, again, we're going to do a separate key terms activity again. And I'm going to do I likely will do a separate PowerPoint on key terms. Here we talk about how life is influenced by thinking and language, that we are focusing on intellectualism. And what Piaget argued is assimilation and accommodation are necessary for learning and mastery of new concepts, which is true. Assimilation is kind of, it's talking about how new knowledge fits into your current knowledge base or current experience base, and then what you need to do, the accommodation for it to make sense. And that is true. This is something that we still believe is true through research in learning. The other piece is cognitive development moves through these stages according to Piaget. I really like this particular graph because it not only tells you the stages and the ages, but gives you an example of what this might look like. Sensory motor stage, we know birth to 2, the children interact with their environment, and they interact through all of their senses, right? Smell, taste, touch, sound, hear. They need, and a lot of them, it always starts with touch. That's how they explore everything. And they start to understand how things function. Between 2 to 7 is that pre-operational stage where we start to see children understand there are symbols in the world that represent other things. This is when pretend play becomes huge. Concrete operational, and this is when rules come into play. How things are within our typical world, how to have a conversation. Knowing that a glass of water is a glass of water, and when I drink it, it will be empty. And then formal operational stage, the adolescent can transcend the concrete situation and think about the future. So thinking about, you might read a book and You can say, oh, these things happened. Huh. Or you can relate, because that's also transcending just what things are actually there and say, I can compare this to my life. Or you can say, oh, in the future, I might become this. You might start thinking about training needed to become a doctor. I'm just thinking out loud here. Does this theory explain atypical development? Can it explain the origins or presentation of disabilities? Again, no. We think about, why is it that some children with autism can't look at the world symbolically? This theory doesn't explain it, but they eventually can with teaching, right? So again, we know that this is not going to fully explain our world. Neo-Piagetian, I think I said that right. So here we get some very important terms: working memory, attention, inhibitory control, optimal level, functional level. Functional level, that's a term you'll hear me say a lot, or developmental level. So we have our chronological age, meaning the child is 3, but the child might perform skills or show use of skills that are appropriate for an 18-month-old. That would be kind of their functional level. Similar to Piaget, mental aspects were important, but they also saw that maturation was critical to thinking and language. As the brain matures, these theorists argue that children are better able to control what they look at or listen to when learning and can resist distractions. And this is true. I can say I've seen this at play. I will have children in my classroom. Because I taught preschool, I would have some children multiple years. And as much as I would like to attribute the success of my students to my teaching, I knew without doubt that the success was also because over the summer they had grown up. They were simply slightly different kids. Atypical development, we start to have maturation come in, but there are still pieces that are missing. So we now understand that maturation, or the maturationist theory where it's predetermined, does come to play when we're thinking about mental cognitive development. It does not explain the fact that there are these other factors that can impact development, and that's going to be the next piece. Lev Vygotsky. Now I'm going to tell you, this is the theory that I most associate with, or that I like the most. Here we get these terms: nonverbal, verbal thought, non-conceptual, and self-directed speech. Terms I use a lot, or the term I use a lot, scaffold, and then zone of proximal development. Like his predecessors in Piaget and Neo-Piagetian theorists, he did believe that language and thinking were critical, but what he also believed was that with these skills, and the development of these skills is meaningless without social context. So basically, independence using more and more complex skills is critical. However, this means adults should not interfere if the child can complete the task independently, but should absolutely provide specific guidance on those more challenging tasks and activities. This is referring to scaffolding. We scaffold within the child's zone of proximal development. So what that child can do with support is the zone of proximal development. And our scaffolds are what we use to guide that child. Again, does this theory explain atypical development? It explains how environmental and social factors can impact children, but there's no specifics on maturation. There's no specifics on disabilities. You'll learn that there are never specifics on disabilities. And then this system you're going to hear more of next week, because it's one that I like. The ecological systems theory. Here we have the term ecology to refer to child development, but then we also bring in our systems. We have our micro, meso, exo, and macro system. And rather, again, similar to Vygotsky, it's not looking at an individual child, it's mainly looking at the child and adolescent within their larger world. And really, what you see in this particular theory that is not in others is that there are these indirect influences, typically social, political, or economic conditions, that absolutely influence development, but they had never been discussed before. And so I'm going to show you, this is my example of my ecological system. It's actually quite limited. So what I put is I'm in the center. My microsystem, which you see these are my stepkids, that's my partner, that's my own family, and then my job here at CCRI. Those are within my microsystem, and my mesosystem is those all interacting with each other. So, my family interacting with my, partner, my family, my, this one doesn't interact as much, my work interacting with my duties with my family and my partner. That's the mesosystem. I wish I should have provided a few more examples, but the mesosystem is the interconnections within your microsystem. Whoops. No. And then we have my exosystem, which are my indirect influences. So here are different governments. These are Rhode Island and New Hampshire, because guess what? These govern what I do. This is where I've been a student, the University of North Carolina, and even I'm teaching, I'm technically still a student there finishing my PhD. And then I put in-laws because they indirectly influence me as well. And so exosystem are your indirect influences. And then macro system is typically society and political influences. Actually, what I should have done is Instagram could be in either one of those because that's cultural. But I put Instagram because I do use that. I put spirituality because I do believe I am a spiritual person, even if I'm not religious. I put the neurodiversity movement because that's something I identify with, something I've done a lot of research and work on. And then this is a map, you can't see it. It's of the Merrimack River, which is in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And it's the area that I associate with because a lot of my family behaves like Merrimack Valley people. And so that's what and they play games like Merrimack Valley people. So I thought giving you my own ecological system would help. This theory, again, does not, in this stage, there are other forms of ecological systems that we'll talk about next week. The way it looks, we can't explain all development. We can't explain atypical. We're not looking at maturation here. We're just looking, this is more a snapshot of a person's ecological system. It does provide a lot of explanation of, if there was trauma, which you don't see as much of that in earlier theories. You see that a little bit in the sociocultural, but then the sociocultural doesn't look at the greater context of what if this person is low SES, right? That's important. Again, but we still don't know about our children with disabilities. So which theory is best? To me, none of them. To me, what's best is all of them together. To me, what's best is knowing that each theory builds off the other, and that the best way for us to understand children is to take all of these theories together and then look at a child's development and see how it makes sense through these lenses. I will say more than anything, ecological systems is what I look at, but then I also need to have an idea of what the milestones are. I need to have an idea of what was that a child's immediate social context by Gotsky. I need to think about assimilation and accommodation. How are we making sense of new thoughts and experiences in our head? To me, it's really none or all of them. There's not a single one that's best. Oh, okay, I wrapped. That was still long. So let's wrap up. We talked about the doll video and the impact of implicit bias and systemic racism on child development, trauma and the developing brain, how trauma has lasting impacts on child and adult behavior. We had a little brain break. Yay! And then we talked about theories and theorists. Who did we talk about? Well, let's see. We talked about maturation theory and predetermined determined development, behaviorist, social learning, environmental. We talked about cognitive development and neo-Piagetian. Mental development focus. Talked about social socio-cultural, sorry. I've always also looked at that as social constructivist, but we'll say socio-cultural and the impact of social context on thinking and language. And then the ecological and more indirect influences. And then I realized psychoanalytic, theory, and conflicts. All right. I guess that's what we talked about today. That's all, folks. After you see this, I would suggest 1, complete your quiz and also your exit ticket. All right. Thank you so much.